I want to start out by thanking Bay for inviting me to speak. And it's great to be on a panel with Pat, who's done great hell-raising on foreign policy, and with Bovard, who's done some of the best hell-raising on American freedom. So it's a real pleasure to be here with folks like that. So, it's interesting. Terry told us what some of the things that the law says, and I'm sure Pat may tell some more, telling us, trying to put our minds at ease because of the exact details in the laws. Now, this is a very interesting method to try to figure out what the government is going to do by looking at the actual text of the law. I mean, this is something that our current Attorney General might say was rather quaint. Now, it's important to keep in mind what matters for the government itself. It's not, the issue is not what a law prohibits, the issue is not what the law allows the government to do, but what the law punishes. And as far as federal agents right now, federal agents can effectively do almost anything that they please. Government is off the leash in this country. And it doesn't matter that the law says the government can only go so far. Government will go further and nothing will happen. Let's just put this in perspective. In 1934, there was a law passed called the National Firearms Act. And there was a provision in that law that said that it was illegal to sell guns with barrels, I believe, less than 18 inches. Well, there was a case in Idaho early in the last decade. An ATF agent out there entrapped a guy by the name of Weaver to sell a gun that was maybe a little bit less than 18 inches. And so he'd violated the law. What happened then, the feds went berserk, basically. The feds did massive surveillance. U.S. Marshals trespassed on the man's land, ambushed his 14-year-old son, shot him in the back and killed him. And then the next day, the FBI snipers came in. An FBI sniper killed his mother as she was holding a baby in the cabin door there in Idaho. And these are folks who were, no threat to anybody. They were just up there on the mountain. Now, the issue is, what happens when federal agents violate the law? Well, in the case of the U.S. Marshal, who shot the boy in the back, he was given the U.S. Marshal Service's highest Valor Award, the Marshal Service's equivalent of the Medal of Honor. And for the FBI sniper who killed the mother holding the baby, the state of Idaho wanted to prosecute him for manslaughter, and Janet Reno's Justice Department moved heaven and earth to block that case. So this is what happened when federal agents went beyond the law in that case. Another National Firearms Act case in Waco. The charge in Waco was that they had violated federal law on requiring a license to own an automatic weapon. Well, it was really unclear what they had done, but the feds assumed they were entitled to absolute power over them simply because of the allegation that broke the law. So you had the ATF launch a no-knock raid. They show up in these cattle trailers. They start out by killing all their dogs and then smashing in the house. A number of people there were killed on both sides. After that, the FBI comes in, and the FBI uses tanks and toxic gas to basically bring the house down to people inside. The FBI assault ends with a fire that kills 80 people. And once again, there is nothing in the National Firearms Act, in the regulations or in the law itself, that says that the government can go in there and launch these kind of massive attacks on American citizens. But it was done. And the FBI guy in charge of that, one of the FBI guys in charge, Larry Potts, was later promoted temporarily. Janet Reno was made a national hero. The news media raced to put a crown on her head. And it's important to keep in mind that as the war on terrorism at home proceeds, there could very easily be other cases like this of Ruby Ridge and Waco's at home in the name of anti-terrorism. Now, it's interesting. A lot of people say that that their rights haven't been violated in this war on terrorism. Well, it depends on whether you care about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. One thing John Ashcroft did in the days after 9/11 was basically suspend habeas corpus. And so you had mass secret arrests in this country. This is something which we had not had since the Civil War. You had over 1,200 people pulled in. And John Ashcroft kept telling people that it was a slander on the government to say that these people's rights were being violated. Well, the Justice Department Inspector General said a lot of these people were held for weeks without being able to contact a lawyer. They were vigorously interrogated and without being able to have any kind of counsel. They were blocked from contacting their families. And you know, people say, well, these were terrorists, or these, Ashcroft kept saying they were suspected terrorists. Well, it turns out that the standard they were using is basically any Arab or Muslim with an immigration problem who was bumped into by the FBI was considered a suspected terrorist. This is a pretty low standard. And this is how they managed to get their numbers up so fast. Now, Ashcroft, Bush, and others stressed that these people's rights were not violated. There were a lot of allegations early on about abuses, and Ashcroft was indignant. Well, the Inspector General investigated, and what he found was, in this one federal prison up there in Brooklyn, federal prison guards hung a T-shirt with an American flag and the motto, "These colors don't run," and they hung that in the wall where the suspected terrorists, who were basically, you know, with minor immigration violations, they hung that in the room where these folks were first brought. And what the federal prison guards would do would be to take the guys' faces and smash them into the wall there on that T-shirt. And that T-shirt got pretty bloody pretty quick. Now, the Inspector General investigated this and found that a lot of federal prison guards had lied, that they had you know, been interviewed, they had sworn there were no such abuses. Now, you think what the government did to Martha Stewart. I mean, there was a question, maybe she made a false statement regarding a stock transaction. She wasn't convicted of inside trading, but simply a false statement. And here you have federal prison guards who are brutalizing people and are lying about to federal investigators, and there's no punishment for them. The point here is, this is what the government is now allowing itself to do. And we have to keep this in mind, because next time it may not just be Arabs and Muslims. Now, it's, you know, it's interesting, Terry was talking about some of the provisions of the Patriot Act. Section 215 is one of the most important ones. And what this does, Section 215 allows the FBI to go in and get a search warrant for one person's email, for a single person's email. And the FBI can go into an internet service provider and force that company to attach a black box to its computer system, and the FBI agent only needs to push a single button on that black box, and the FBI can automatically copy all the email of all the customers of that internet service provider. So you have a search warrant for one person, and the FBI can copy 100,000 people's email. Congress and the courts are doing a terrible job of looking into how these powers are being used. Now, there's, you know, there's some people that think that we should not worry about these type of surveillance powers. I mean, because the government is our friend. Well, you know, you can tell that at Waco and Ruby Ridge. But, for instance, there are so many new programs coming out. There was a program that the Transportation Security Administration is pushing to do surveillance of airline passengers. And it's building up these databases. And one of the things that they're doing is making a database of everybody who requests a certain meal preference. So what you have is the federal government could be building a database of the names and the home addresses of everybody who asked for a kosher meal, for instance. Now, is it good to have a federal database on that? Do we need that, and how does that make us safe? Not only that, but on this airline surveillance, passenger surveillance system, the feds have made a lot of false statements on this. This is something that Bovard helped expose a year and a half ago, I believe. The feds claimed that they were not going to be using it for, it was only going to be for airline security. But then it turned out that they might also trigger alerts for anybody wanted for federal crimes. And there was a report in the Washington Post that up to 2% of airline passengers could be labeled red and prohibited from boarding airlines. You know, that's a lot of people. And the feds make a lot of mistakes in how they, you know, in how they classify people. Now, it's, you know, the TSA, you know, folks talk about how the government has made us more secure since 9/11. Well, the TSA isn't the best example. There was a report, I believe, in the last week or so that showed that the TSA is failing miserably at making airports more secure. But what the TSA is succeeding at is trying to make Americans grovel at the feet of federal agents. Because the TSA has a provision now, the TSA can fine you up to $1,500 if they don't like your attitude when you're going through these airport checkpoints. I don't know that that makes us either more free or more secure, but on top of that, TSA launched a policy last August and September after the Chechens may have knocked down a Russian flight. The TSA suddenly decided that its agents needed to do basically breast exams at the airports. There were a lot of reports on this, a lot of complaints. The TSA became much more aggressive about searching women's bosoms. And they didn't find any terrorists. But what they did is basically, completely, it was total degradation. But it was a total invasion of the rights and the privacy of scores of thousands of women. And once again, this is a policy that TSA pulls out of its ear. There was no formal hearing on this. Now, a lot of people here might think that the terrorist threat only means Arabs and Muslims. Well, there was a lot of complaints in the press in the last week or two that the government was not doing enough to focus on right-wing terrorist groups. There were a lot of people that considered Eric Rudolph a terrorist. Y'all might recall that he was hanging out down there in the mountains of North Carolina for several years. The FBI, made a big deal about going down there to find him and didn't find squat. But what would have happened if President Clinton or either Bill or Hillary, or if someone else had said that it was necessary to send in the U.S. military to western North Carolina to find Eric Rudolph? Now, there was a memo by one of the top folks in the Justice Department who said that we have to keep in mind that after 9/11, that if the president decides to send in the military here at home, the Fourth Amendment no longer applies. So that means that if Bush sent the military into western North Carolina, everybody in that part of that state would have no more constitutional rights. And that is a profound danger. It's interesting how the president has been able to basically seize absolute power in many ways since 9/11. Bush's power to label somebody an enemy combatant. This sounded basically non-controversial at first, and it was only going to be for foreigners until they changed their mind and said he could also do that to Americans. Now, what this is the president's right to nullify all rights based solely on the president's assertion. Now, Bush kept talking about this. This was only for battlefield combatants that they captured in Afghanistan, for instance. Well, there was a court case recently. It turned out that there was a Turkish guy, a German Turk, who was traveling in Pakistan after 9/11, and he was seized on a bus and taken to Guantanamo. And they did 3 years of interrogations, 3 years of investigations, and found nothing on the guy. And there was a federal court hearing because there was no evidence, but there was simply one memo was unsigned, submitted by one, apparently a Pentagon official, and that was the only evidence they had, even though they'd done all these other check-ins. They had nothing to hold this guy on. But that was all it took, is an unsigned memo. And that symbolizes how broad the president's power has become. Now, there is one other issue that we need to look at in understanding what the American government has become, and that is torture. Bush, the memos by the president's top lawyers, the White House counsel, these folks have said the president is above the law. And the president has a right to order torture even in violation of federal criminal law. I mean, this is not the vision of government our founding fathers created. And to say that the president can order torture, it would be naive to assume he will only be torturing bad guys. So, thanks.